A new beginning. Thomas Blake stood in front of his bathroom mirror, his weathered hands carefully adjusting the navy blue tie around his neck. The fabric was old but neatly pressed, just like the man who wore it. His reflection stared back at him, silver hair that refused to stay in place, deep lines creasing his forehead, and tired but kind brown eyes that had seen more than a lifetime's worth of stories. At 63 years old, most men were thinking about retirement, about slowing down and enjoying the peace they had earned. But not Thomas. Today wasn't just another day. It was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. His modest house, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and old books, buzzed with an unusual nervousness. Every room carried traces of his 40-year career as a teacher, dog-eared textbooks, handwritten lesson plans stacked high on his desk, cardboard boxes filled with craft supplies, and drawings from students who had long since grown up. But today, his house wasn't just going to be his anymore. He walked to the dresser, his heart pounding as he picked up the thick manila folder resting on top. Adoption papers. He had spent years preparing for this: interviews, background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations. Every page in this folder was proof of his dedication, evidence that he was ready to open his heart and his home to 5 children who had been let down too many times before. 5 children. Most people thought he was crazy. At your age, they had asked, incredulous. 5 kids? But Thomas knew, deep in his bones, that this was the right thing to do. He had spent his entire life teaching children, guiding them, helping them grow. He had loved every single student who had walked through his classroom door, but when the school bell rang, they all went home. These 5 children had nowhere to go. And that was going to change today. The drive to the foster care center was long and quiet, giving Thomas too much time to think. What if they didn't like him? What if they resented him? He wasn't young anymore. He didn't have the energy of a 30-year-old father. Would they see him as some old man trying to play hero? He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. No. This isn't about you, Thomas. It's about them. When he arrived, Mrs. Anderson, the social worker who had handled his case, greeted him with a warm but tired smile. She had seen many children come and go, and she knew this would be one of the more difficult cases. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Blake?" she asked as they walked toward the meeting room. Thomas nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Mrs. Anderson sighed, tucking a clipboard under her arm. "I won't lie to you. These kids have been through a lot. They've lost trust in adults. They don't believe in promises anymore. They've been in and out of homes so many times that they've stopped expecting anyone to stay." Thomas swallowed hard. He knew that. He had read every report, every heartbreaking detail about how they ended up here. Abandonment. Neglect. Trauma. But that didn't scare him. What scared him was the thought of them never finding a real home. "Just bring them in," he said. The door opened, and one by one, they stepped in. Daniel, 12 years old. The eldest. The protector. His posture was stiff, his jaw tight, his dark brown eyes watching everything with quiet suspicion. His arms were crossed over his chest, a silent warning to anyone who thought they could get close to him. Maya, 10 years old. Sharp, intelligent, and skeptical. She glanced at Thomas, her eyes calculating, as if already analyzing how long this would last before he gave up like all the others. Elijah, 9 years old. A bundle of restless energy, small for his age but tough, like he had something to prove. He shifted from foot to foot, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. Zoe, 7 years old. Soft-spoken, delicate, with large eyes that darted around the room, looking for the safest place to stand. She clutched a tattered teddy bear, the only thing in the world that had never left her. Isaac, 5 years old. The baby of the group. He stayed close to Daniel, half hiding behind his older brother's leg, peeking up at Thomas with wide, uncertain eyes. Thomas took a slow breath. 5 children. 5 fragile hearts. And it was now his job to make them believe in family again. He knelt down, making sure he was at eye level with them. He didn't reach out, didn't push. He just looked at them, letting them take him in, letting them decide what they saw. "I know you don't know me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I know you don't trust me yet. That's okay." He glanced at Daniel, whose jaw clenched slightly. Thomas could see the tension in his small body, the way he carried the weight of being the eldest. "I'm not here to replace anyone," Thomas continued. "And I won't make you any promises I can't keep. But what I can promise is this: I won't leave. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. This is your home, if you want it to be." Silence. Then, Isaac moved first. The tiny boy took one hesitant step forward, then another. He reached out a small, trembling hand and touched Thomas's. A spark. A moment. A connection. And then, slowly, the others followed. Daniel didn't say anything, but his arms dropped from his chest. Maya studied Thomas for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Elijah smirked like he was ready to test every boundary Thomas had. Zoe stayed close to her teddy bear but inched just a little closer. And Isaac, the littlest one, wrapped his arms around Thomas's neck. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat, holding the boy gently, feeling the unspoken fear in his tiny grip. It wasn't much. But it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you needed. That evening, Thomas drove them home. They sat in silence, looking out the window, watching the world blur past them. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with books and old furniture, with blankets on every couch and a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread. For the first time in a long time, these children had a real home. For the first time in a long time, Thomas was no longer alone. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But as they sat down for dinner together that night, 5 plates in front of him, 5 children watching him with hesitant hope. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the beginning of something beautiful, the struggles of love. The first few weeks were the hardest. Thomas had spent decades teaching children, shaping young minds, and mentoring students through the ups and downs of life. But nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of raising 5 traumatized children on his own. It wasn't just about providing food, shelter, and school supplies. It was about earning their trust, something far more delicate than anything he had ever handled before. The walls between them. From the very first morning, Thomas learned quickly that these kids weren't going to make it easy. Daniel, the eldest at 12 years old, had taken on the role of protector long ago. He wasn't just their brother, he was their shield. Every time Thomas tried to help, Daniel would step in first. If Zoe needed help opening a jar, Daniel did it. If Isaac fell and scraped his knee, Daniel cleaned it. If Thomas offered to help Maya with her homework, Daniel insisted she could do it herself. Thomas saw what was happening. Daniel didn't want to owe anyone anything. He didn't believe in the kindness of adults, not anymore. Because in his world, adults always left. So, every night, while the other kids slept, Thomas would find Daniel sitting in the living room, wide awake, his small body tense like he was standing guard. "You don't have to do that, you know," Thomas said softly one night. Daniel didn't even look at him. "Do what?" "Protect them. Watch over them every second. That's my job now." A pause. Then, Daniel turned to him, his young face too serious for a 12-year-old. "And what if you leave too?" Thomas swallowed. The pain in that boy's voice was raw, unfiltered. "I won't," he said. Daniel scoffed. "That's what everyone says." Thomas could have argued. could have made more promises. But instead, he did the only thing that mattered. He showed up. Every morning. Every meal. Every school drop-off. He showed up. Because words meant nothing to a kid who had only known broken promises. The fighter, the skeptic, and the silent one. Maya was the skeptic. She questioned everything. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one afternoon as they sat at the dining table, her math book open in front of her. Thomas blinked. "Doing what?" "Taking care of us. You don't owe us anything." Thomas put down his pen, studying her. "Do I need to owe you something to love you?" She flinched, like the word love was a foreign language. "You don't even know us," she muttered. "That's true," Thomas said. "But I want to." Maya didn't respond. She just turned back to her homework, her defenses still up. Elijah, on the other hand, was a fighter. He had energy to spare, a fire in his eyes that made him restless and reckless. He pushed boundaries constantly. Climbed the kitchen counter to steal cookies right before dinner. Skipped his homework and shoved his worksheets under the couch. Snuck out of the house and rode his bike past the neighborhood limits. And when Thomas scolded him, he smirked, daring him to get angry. Because anger was familiar. "Go ahead," Elijah said one evening after getting caught sneaking out again. "Yell at me. That's what adults do, right?" Thomas crossed his arms. "Not this one." Elijah frowned. "Then what, you're gonna send me back?" Thomas sighed. "No. But you are grounded." Elijah groaned, but there was something else in his eyes too. Confusion. Like he wasn't used to consequences that weren't cruel. Zoe and Isaac, the two youngest, weren't troublemakers. They were scared. Zoe spoke softly, as if afraid she would be too loud and someone would get angry. She barely touched her food, always leaving a little on her plate, as if saving it for later. It took Thomas weeks to realize why. She was used to not knowing when her next meal would come. Isaac, the baby of the group, never asked for anything. He just took whatever was given to him, never demanding more. So, Thomas started small. At dinner, he made sure Zoe saw that there was always more food in the pot. When Isaac hesitated before taking a second cookie, Thomas smiled and said, "You can have as many as you want, kiddo." Zoe started eating a little more. Isaac started reaching for things without asking permission. It wasn't much. But it was progress. The night everything changed. One night, a storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled outside, shaking the windows, rain hammering against the roof. Thomas was in bed when he heard it. A soft, fearful whimper. He got up, stepping into the hallway, and saw a small shadow standing near his bedroom door. Isaac. His tiny frame shook, his fists clenched around his pajama shirt. Thomas knelt. "Hey, buddy. What's wrong?" Isaac's voice was barely a whisper. I'm scared." Thomas's heart clenched. He held out his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Isaac rushed into them. Thomas carried him back to his room, tucking him in. "Do you want me to stay?" Isaac nodded. So, Thomas sat beside his bed, humming softly, rubbing Isaac's small back until he finally drifted off. And then, the door creaked open. Zoe. She held her teddy bear close, shifting nervously in the doorway. Without a word, she climbed onto the bed and curled up beside Isaac. Then, Elijah walked in. "Storm woke me up," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "I guess I'll sleep here too." And then came Maya. She didn't say anything. Just sat on the floor, pulling a blanket around herself. Then, Daniel appeared. He looked at Thomas. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel sighed and sat on the floor beside Maya. And just like that, they were all together. For the first time, the kids chose to be close to him. Thomas didn't say a word. He just stayed. Because sometimes, love wasn't about grand gestures. Sometimes, it was just showing up. The first step forward. The next morning, everything was different. Elijah didn't break a rule before breakfast. Zoe actually finished her plate. Isaac held Thomas's hand as they walked to the car. Maya gave him a real smile for the first time. And Daniel, who had never once let Thomas touch him before, patted his shoulder as he passed. It was small. But Thomas knew. It was the beginning of something bigger. And he was never going to let them down, the years of sacrifice. The months turned into years, and Thomas Blake dedicated everything to his children. He had stepped into fatherhood late, at an age where most men were thinking about retirement and grandchildren, not PTA meetings and science fairs. But he never once regretted his choice. Each child came with their own battles, their own traumas, their own ways of testing him, but through every challenge, every heartbreak, and every setback, Thomas never stopped loving them. The silent burden of parenthood. Fatherhood was not easy. It was early mornings and late nights, helping Daniel with his history homework after he had spent hours pretending he didn't need help. It was broken furniture when Elijah's temper got the best of him, followed by hours of calm conversations about how anger was okay, but destruction wasn't. It was Maya refusing to ask for help, always trying to prove that she could do everything on her own, only to break down at 3 a.m. in the kitchen because the weight was too much. It was Zoe crying in the middle of the night, and Isaac hiding his emotions behind nervous smiles. It was never having a moment of silence but also knowing that the sound of their voices, their laughter, their presence, was the greatest gift of all. But it came at a cost. Thomas had to give up a lot to raise them. He sold his old car and drove an old, rattling minivan instead, just to afford their school fees. He stopped buying new clothes for himself, making sure they had everything they needed first. He put off medical checkups, prioritizing their well-being before his own. He worked extra hours, took on tutoring jobs on weekends, and gave up the quiet life he could have had, because their future mattered more. And even on the hardest days, he never wavered. Daniel, the reluctant leader. As Daniel grew older, the weight on his shoulders never fully disappeared. Even though Thomas had proven, time and time again, that he wasn't leaving, Daniel still held on to that deep fear. One night, at 15 years old, he came home with bruised knuckles and a torn backpack. Thomas sat him down in the kitchen, poured him a cup of tea, and didn't say anything at first. Eventually, Daniel spoke. Some guys at school were messing with Isaac, he muttered, staring at the table. I handled it. Handled it. Thomas sighed. Son, fighting isn't the answer. Daniel's jaw clenched. What was I supposed to do? Just let them treat him like that? No, Thomas said gently. But you can't carry the whole world on your back. You're allowed to ask for help. Daniel scoffed. No one ever helped us before. Thomas reached across the table, covering Daniel's scraped hands with his own. I am. And I always will. For the first time, Daniel let himself believe it. Maya, the dreamer with doubts. At 16, Maya was brilliant. She had a sharp mind, a hunger for knowledge, and a passion for engineering that could change the world. But she didn't believe in herself. One night, Thomas found her sitting in the backyard, staring at the sky. Couldn't sleep, he asked, settling beside her. Maya hesitated, then muttered, I got an acceptance letter. Thomas's heart leapt. For what? An advanced STEM program, she said. It's really competitive. They only take 20 kids in the whole state. Thomas beamed. Maya, that's amazing. She didn't smile back. What if I don't belong there, she whispered. What if they figure out I'm not as smart as they think? Thomas's chest ached. He had seen this fear before, the belief that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't deserve good things. "Maya," he said softly, "do you know why I believe in you?" She shook her head. "Because you don't stop," Thomas said. "Because no matter how hard things get, you always push forward. You don't just belong in that program, you deserve it." For the first time in years, Maya didn't argue. She just let herself believe it. Elijah, the fighter who found his voice. Elijah's anger had always been his biggest battle. At 17, he was a mix of fire and frustration, always feeling like he had to prove something to the world. One day, he got suspended for punching a teacher's car. Thomas picked him up from school, silent the entire drive home. Finally, in the driveway, he said, "Talk to me." Elijah exploded. "Why do I have to be the one to stay calm?" he shouted. "Why do I have to be the one to hold it all in? Why do I have to pretend I'm not furious about everything that's happened to us?" Thomas let him rage. Let him pour out every hurt, every frustration, every scar that hadn't healed. Then, when Elijah finally fell silent, Thomas said, "You don't have to hold it in. But you have to find a way to turn that fire into something that builds instead of destroys." Elijah went quiet. The next day, he signed up for a boxing program, and for the first time, his anger became his strength, not his weakness. Zoe and Isaac, the ones who never asked for anything. By the time Zoe was 14 and Isaac was 12, they had changed the most. Zoe, once the quietest, became a writer, filling notebooks with words she had once been afraid to speak. Isaac, the shyest, found his passion in teaching, just like Thomas. One evening, as Thomas sat at the dinner table, Isaac hesitated before speaking. I think I want to be a teacher." Thomas's breath caught. Isaac fidgeted. "Like you." It was a simple sentence, but it meant everything. Because this was proof that everything Thomas had done, everything he had given up, had mattered. The years of sacrifice, the years of love. Through late nights, early mornings, and sacrifices too many to count, Thomas had raised 5 children who had once believed in nothing. Now, Daniel became a soldier, protecting others as he had always protected his siblings. Maya became an engineer, creating solutions to problems she once thought she wasn't smart enough to solve. Elijah became a lawyer, fighting battles with words instead of fists. Zoe became a writer, telling stories that had once been trapped inside her. Isaac became a teacher, carrying Thomas's legacy forward. The years had not been easy. But as Thomas sat in his old chair, looking at the photographs of his children hanging on the walls, he knew he had done something right. Because in the end, it wasn't about what he had lost. It was about what he had given. And what he had received in return. The unexpected turn. Years had passed. The house that had once been full of life and noise was now strangely quiet. Thomas Blake, now 78 years old, sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the front yard. His once strong hands, the same hands that had tucked in 5 children, cooked countless meals, and wiped away years of pain, now trembled slightly from age. The home, once bustling with voices arguing over breakfast, laughter spilling from the living room, and late-night whispers of secrets between siblings, now stood empty. His children had grown up and moved on. It was exactly what he had wanted for them: successful lives, bright futures, and happiness beyond the walls of this old house. But loneliness had crept in, wrapping around his chest like an old, familiar ache. They visited less. Their phone calls became infrequent. Holidays were spent with their own families now. And though Thomas never said it aloud, it hurt. Had they forgotten him? Had the sacrifices he made, the years of struggle, love, and patience, become nothing more than a distant childhood memory? He told himself it was just part of life. Children grow up. They move away. But deep down, he feared something worse. That they had left him behind. A call that changed everything. It had been weeks since his last call from any of them. Then, one evening, his phone rang. It was Daniel. "Hey, Dad," his voice was warm, but there was something else underneath it. Nervousness? Excitement? Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Well, it's about time you called. Thought I was talking to ghosts over here." Daniel chuckled. "Sorry, Dad. Things have been busy." Busy. Thomas had heard that word too many times now. But before he could dwell on it, Daniel said something strange. "Listen, can you be ready by tomorrow evening?" Thomas frowned. "Ready for what?" "Just, trust me, okay? I'll pick you up at 6. And then the call ended before he could ask more. Thomas sat in silence, staring at the phone. Something was happening. But what? The drive into the unknown. The next evening, at exactly 6 p.m., a black car pulled into his driveway. It wasn't Daniel's usual truck. And it wasn't just Daniel inside. As Thomas stepped out onto the porch, he was stunned to see all 5 of them. Daniel. Maya. Elijah. Zoe. Isaac. His children. All together. For the first time in years. They stepped out of the car, smiles stretching across their faces, but there was something else in their eyes. Excitement. And secrecy. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, eyeing them suspiciously. Elijah smirked. "You'll see, old man." They helped him into the car, and soon, they were on the road. But Thomas couldn't ignore the weight in the air, the unspoken tension, the nervous glances they exchanged. Something was happening. And he wasn't ready for it. A house like no other. The car pulled up to a quiet neighborhood Thomas had never seen before. The street was lined with modern houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and a warmth that reminded him of home. And then, he saw it. A house. A beautiful, brand new house. Daniel turned off the engine and cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to show you something." His children guided him out of the car, leading him toward the front door. It had a white porch with chairs set up just like the one at his old home. The moment they stepped inside, Thomas's breath caught. Because it looked familiar. The wooden floors. The soft lighting. The furniture, even the kitchen table was the same. And then he realized. This was his home. Not the actual house, but a perfect replica. Down to the pictures on the walls, the books on the shelves, even the old clock that had sat in his living room for decades. Thomas's throat tightened. "What is this?" Maya stepped forward, eyes shimmering. "Dad, we built this for you." His mind spun. "Built?" "For years, we've been working on this," Elijah said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We wanted to make sure you'd never be alone." Zoe smiled softly. "We know you wouldn't leave the old house. So, we brought it to you." Isaac stepped closer. "It's in the same neighborhood where we all live now. You'll be 5 minutes away from all of us." Thomas's legs suddenly felt weak. They had done this for him? After everything, after all these years. They hadn't forgotten. They had spent years planning this. Building it. For him. The truth that changed everything. Tears blurred Thomas's vision. I don't deserve this," he whispered, shaking his head. "I was just doing what any father would do." Daniel placed a strong hand on his shoulder. "No, Dad," he said, his voice steady. "You did what no one else would. You gave up everything for us," Maya added. "You spent your whole life making sure we were okay." Elijah smirked. "And now, it's our turn to take care of you." Zoe's voice was barely a whisper. Because you never left us. Isaac, the youngest, hugged him, the same way he had as a little boy, all those years ago. We love you, Dad. Thomas felt his heart break and heal all at once. They had been planning this for years, saving money, working together, making sure their father would never feel abandoned. And for the first time in a long time, he realized he had never been alone. Because love always comes full circle. And in the end, the sacrifices he had made? They had been worth everything. The house of forever. That night, they ate dinner together in the new house, just like old times. The laughter, the stories, the warmth, it was all still there. They had gone off into the world. They had become their own people. But they had never forgotten home. And as Thomas sat at the table, surrounded by his family, his children, his legacy, he finally understood. He had never lost them. And he never would. Because in this house, in this place built from love and gratitude, he would always belong. Forever. The truth unveiled. That first night in the new house, Thomas barely slept. Not because he wasn't comfortable, on the contrary, the bed was just the right firmness, the pillows fluffed to perfection. The warmth of the blankets wrapped around him like an embrace. No, he didn't sleep because his heart was too full. He kept replaying the evening over and over in his mind. The way his children had led him through the front door of the house they had built for him. The way they had sat around the dinner table, talking and laughing like no time had passed at all. It was surreal. For so long, he had believed they had moved on, that they had left him behind. But now he knew the truth. They had spent years planning this for him. They had never left. And he had never been more grateful. The morning after, an unexpected surprise. The next morning, Thomas awoke to the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes. He shuffled out of bed, still adjusting to the fact that this was his new home, an exact replica of the one he had lived in for decades, yet somehow, better. When he reached the kitchen, he nearly laughed at the sight before him. His 5 grown children were arguing over breakfast. I said no burnt pancakes, Elijah. Maya scolded, hands on her hips. Elijah smirked as he flipped another pancake onto the plate. They're not burnt. They're extra crispy. Zoe groaned. That's what people say when they ruin food. Isaac, sitting at the table, grinned. I think they look fine. Daniel took a sip of coffee and raised an eyebrow. They look like hockey pucks. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. It was just like the old days. For years, the house had been silent, and now it was alive again. It felt right. A truth he never expected. As they ate breakfast together, Maya cleared her throat. There's something else we need to tell you, Dad, she said, exchanging glances with her siblings. Thomas set his fork down. Should I be worried? Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Not worried. Just surprised. Thomas frowned. Okay, go on. Elijah smirked. Do you remember when we were kids, and you always told us that family wasn't about blood, it was about love? Thomas nodded slowly. Maya took a deep breath. Well, we believe that too. And that's why, we legally changed our last names. Silence. For a moment, Thomas thought he had misheard them. But then he saw the truth in their eyes. One by one, his children pulled out small envelopes. Inside were official documents. Daniel Blake. Maya Blake. Elijah Blake. Zoe Blake. Isaac Blake. Tears blurred Thomas's vision. He had spent his entire life loving these children, raising them, sacrificing for them. And now, they had done the one thing he never expected. They had made it official. They had chosen his name. They had chosen him. The weight of that moment. Thomas's hands trembled as he held the papers. You all did this?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isaac nodded. "We've been planning it for a long time. We wanted to wait for the right moment." Elijah grinned. "Figured surprising you with a house wasn't enough." Zoe wiped her eyes. "You've been our dad from the start. We just wanted the world to know it, too." Maya reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "This isn't just about a name, Dad. It's about belonging. You took us in when no one else wanted us. You gave us everything. And now, we get to carry your name, because you're our father. Always have been. Always will be." Thomas covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed. He had spent years worrying about whether they had forgotten him. But now, he understood. They had never left. They had been waiting for the right time to show him just how much he meant to them. A father's pride. For the rest of the day, Thomas could hardly look at them without tearing up. Every time he said their names, Blake, 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 his heart swelled. He had given them a home. They had given him a legacy. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the six of them sat on the porch together, watching the golden light settle over their quiet neighborhood. Isaac leaned his head on Thomas's shoulder. Elijah stretched his legs out in front of him. "So, Dad, what do you think of your new house?" Thomas exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. "I think I have everything I ever wanted." Maya nudged him. "Even the kids who gave you a hard time?" Thomas chuckled. "Especially those ones." They sat in silence for a long time. No words were needed. Because the truth was already known. Love wasn't just about the past. It was about the choices we make every single day. And in choosing his name, in giving him this home, in coming back when he feared they never would, his children had proven something greater than words ever could. Thomas wasn't just their guardian. He wasn't just the man who had raised them. He was their father. Forever. And nothing in the world could ever change that. A family's legacy. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Thomas adjusted to his new home, though it felt strange at first, a house so familiar yet completely new. He caught himself reaching for light switches in the wrong places or expecting his old, creaky floorboards to groan under his weight. But one thing was clear, this house was built with love. His children had thought of everything. The bookshelves in the study were lined with his favorite novels. The backyard had a rocking chair, just like the one he used to sit in after long days of teaching. The walls weren't just decorated with art, they were covered in framed memories. Photos of his kids as children, laughing at the kitchen table. School graduation pictures. Candid moments, Maya fixing a broken chair, Daniel teaching Isaac how to ride a bike, Zoe curled up with a book, Elijah with a goofy grin after a prank. Thomas had never realized how many moments had been captured. And now, in this house, they all lived on. The next chapter begins. One morning, as Thomas sipped his coffee on the porch, Daniel sat down beside him. "So, how does it feel?" he asked. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "To have my name on 5 amazing, slightly annoying, fully grown children?" Daniel chuckled. "I was going to say, to live closer to us, but yeah, that too." Thomas sighed, looking out at the quiet street. "It feels right." Daniel nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, Dad." Thomas set his mug down. "Oh? I want to have kids one day," Daniel admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "And when I do, I want them to know you. I want them to hear your stories. I want them to learn from you, the way I did." Thomas's chest tightened. Daniel had been the most guarded of all his children. The one who took the longest to call him Dad. The one who carried the most weight on his young shoulders. And now, here he was, speaking about the next generation. Thomas swallowed hard, nodding. I'd like that, son. A new kind of love. As the months passed, Thomas's family grew. Maya brought her fiancé over for dinner, nervously introducing him to Thomas. Dad, this is Caleb. He's an engineer too, but don't hold that against him. Thomas shook the young man's hand and leaned in with a mock-serious expression. If you ever hurt my daughter, just remember, I taught high school for 40 years. I know how to deal with troublemakers. Caleb laughed, a little nervously. Maya rolled her eyes. Dad, please don't scare him. Elijah, now a lawyer, had finally found peace. His fiery temper had become his greatest tool in the courtroom, fighting for people who had no voice. Zoe had become a successful writer, publishing her first novel. The dedication in the front page read, "For the man who gave me a home when I had none. For the father who taught me that love is the greatest story ever told." Isaac was teaching at a school not far from town, following in Thomas's footsteps. One afternoon, he sat across from his father, nervous. I don't know if I'll be as good a teacher as you, Isaac admitted. Thomas gave him a knowing smile. Son, you already are. The first grandchild. The day Daniel's wife gave birth to their first child, Thomas sat in the waiting room, anxious. Then, Daniel stepped out, beaming. It's a boy, he announced. Dad, I want you to meet him. Thomas followed his son into the hospital room, his heart racing. And there, in a small bundle of blankets, was his grandson. Daniel turned to him. We named him after you. Thomas blinked. What? Daniel smiled. His name is Thomas Daniel Blake. The air left Thomas's lungs. He looked down at the tiny child in his arms, his vision blurring with tears. His legacy was alive. His name, his love, would live on. And in that moment, holding his grandson, Thomas realized something. This was never just about raising 5 children. It was about changing a generation. And now, that love would continue, passed down like a torch that would never burn out. A life well lived. Years passed. The Blake family grew, changed, and flourished. Thomas, now an old man in his late 80s, sat in his favorite chair, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His hands, once steady and strong, were now wrinkled and frail. But his heart? It had never been fuller. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Maya sat beside him. You know, Dad, she said softly, when we were kids, I never thought we'd end up here. I never thought we'd have a real family. Thomas smiled, taking her hand in his. I did. She looked at him, eyes shining. You really believed it, didn't you? I did, he said again. Because love always finds a way. The room was filled with laughter, warmth, and stories. The home he once feared would be silent forever was now overflowing with life. His children. His grandchildren. His legacy. And as Thomas closed his eyes that night, listening to the sound of his family just outside his door, he knew. He had done something right. Because family isn't about blood. It's about love. And love lasts forever. The final lesson. Years later, when Thomas was gone, his children gathered once more. They sat on the porch of his house, his final gift to them. Daniel spoke first. He gave us everything. Maya smiled. And never asked for anything in return. Elijah exhaled. But we gave him something too. Zoe whispered, we gave him a family. Isaac nodded. And love that never ends. And as they looked out at the world, they knew, they would carry his legacy forward. Because Thomas Blake hadn't just raised 5 children. He had changed 5 lives. And that? That would never be forgotten.